Ben, the White House statement came out tonight. It seemed to be more than several hours in the making, but the language is about as strong as those statements get.
Yeah, because what we're dealing with is something that we've never quite seen before. We have a situation where a plane is taking off from one European country and on completely absurd premises is basically hijacked by a government of Belarus for the purposes of detaining a critic of the government. And this is so dangerous, Lawrence, because what it says about the situation for people in Belarus, but also because it suggests that international air travel, something that we all take for granted, is no longer safe. If you fly over the airspace of some authoritarian country, if this is able to stand, if there are not consequences for this action, then we could see this tactic repeated in the future. And this is Vladimir Putin, who, let's be very clear, there's no way Lukashenko is still in power today without the sponsorship of Vladimir Putin. This is once again an effort to really upend international norms and put democracies on the defensive.
In a situation like this, what's the likely answer to what did Vladimir Putin know and when did he know it? Would he know of a plan like this before it was executed?
Well, obviously, the administration called for an investigation that's necessary. I think at first blush, Lawrence, this appeared to be a quite complex operation. In order to fabricate this cover story about needing to ground the airline because of a bomb threat, the reports that there were kind of sketchy people on board who seemed to be involved in the operation. Russia is just far more sophisticated than Belarus, its much smaller neighbor. So I think it's hard for those of us who are national security analysts to think that Russia didn't have some role in planning this or some foreknowledge of it. Lukashenko has really looked to Putin to shore himself up ever since he basically tried to steal an election that most international and independent observers think he probably lost. And given that reliance on Putin, again, it's hard to see something of this complex nature going forward without at least some Russian hand behind it.
What does Putin think of something like this? Is this something that Putin thinks this is good, this shows the kind of power we have, or might he think that was an idiotic thing, you shouldn't have done that over just a reporter who was causing you problems?
Well, look, I think sometimes Putin likes to demonstrate that he is willing to flout international norms without regard to the consequences, to essentially call the bluff of the democratic world. I'm reminded of a situation that was probably some form of accident when a civilian airliner was shot down over eastern Ukraine, over an area where Russian-backed separatists were very active. Putin obfuscated, he blamed Ukraine, he blamed the United States. But again, I think, part of the point of that whole episode was that Putin feels like he can annex countries, he can poison opponents as he did to Alexei Navalny and throw them in prison. He can assassinate people in third countries, as we've seen take place in places like the UK, in part to make a point to any opponents of his regime, or in this case, Lukashenko's making a point to any opponents of his regime, that if you're an opponent, you're not safe anywhere. And don't think that just because you live in the democracies that you're safe there. And that's a world that's not safe for any of us, Lawrence.
What are the options presented to President Biden in a situation like this? You would be in the Obama White House, you'd be part of the team putting those options together.
Well, I think the near-term target was this issue of aviation, and to show that on the specific question of international air travel, that Belarus is basically kicked out of that system, that air carriers cannot fly into and out of Belarus. They cannot fly through Belarus's airspace, essentially cutting off Belarus from Europe. I think secondly, though, the Biden administration is going to have to look at what kind of sanctions can be imposed on Lukashenko and his inner circle. And the reality is that guys like Lukashenko rely upon wealthy oligarchs, cronies, to finance their autocracy. And I think this is a case where we are probably going to be looking at coordinating efforts with the Europeans to go beyond the sanctions that are already in place and really throw the book at Lukashenko and his cronies in sanctioning them, trying to freeze their assets, cut off their money trails that they depend upon, but also potentially exposing the depths of their corruption. This guy who they detained was a heroic journalist, someone who blew the whistle on some of the things that Lukashenko was doing. That's part of what gave so much motivation to the opposition there, this frustration with autocracy and corruption. I think that the United States and Europe need to look at how can we be more vocal, more transparent in shining a light on those things and providing support to the democratic opposition inside of Belarus through essentially expressions of solidarity and support for their cause.